Hello and welcome to the Work of Thy Hands podcast, where we interview Christian creatives conversing on the ways they have seen their creative projects as co-creative efforts with Christ, times they have drawn inspiration from the physical creation, and their thoughts surrounding the nature of work as a creative. I'm your host, Allison Ramirez, and today I'm thrilled to be welcoming our next guest, Thomas Salerno. As a creative, Thomas wears many hats. He is an educator, author, freelance essayist, and podcaster. He has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and worked for many years in the field of museum science. He currently works as an educator and guide at Raynham Hall, a colonial period home and history museum on Long Island, with a focus on the Revolutionary War. As a freelance writer, he regularly contributes essays and spiritual reflections to Bishop Robert Barron's apostolate, Word on Fire. His debut children's nonfiction book, The Riddle of the Tongue Stones, will be published this year by Word on Fire Votive. In his spare time, Thomas writes fiction, including paranormal, sci-fi, and epic fantasy. He is a podcaster for the StarQuest Production Network, where he is a regular host and/or panelist on The Secrets of Middle-earth, The Secrets of Star Wars, and The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. He maintains a Substack newsletter called Page Turning. The threefold goal of all his creative work is to entertain, educate, and inspire his audience. Welcome, Thomas. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Allison. It's a joy to be here for this discussion.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your background with writing and how you got into creating, because from your bio, it sounds like you've done a lot of different things, museum studies and writing and podcasts. So tell me where this love for creative things started.
Well, I've always had a creative streak, and as a kid, I always had a notebook in tow, scribbling away or writing stories. My younger brother and I used to create whole fake television shows, write out the scripts for different episodes, and we had these whole worlds with all of these characters. I think, honestly, though, the first book that I ever read that really inspired me creatively and made me think, wow, I want to write someday and create a fantastic story like this, was James Gurney's Dinotopia books, if you've ever read those, because
I think I've heard of them before.
Those are they're the size of coffee table books, and they're illustrated. On almost every page is a painting, usually an oil painting that Gurney has done. And it's about this magical island where humans and talking dinosaurs live together. And it's a world as rich and complex as like Middle-earth or Narnia. And I discovered Dinotopia before either of those. So that was kind of like my first entry into this idea that you could create a whole fictional world with people and places, that I could just get lost in and feel like, oh, I could live in this place, and that's why I started creating my own kind of immersive worlds, like just as a creative hobby when I was a kid. And I would draw pictures to go along with them. And I have always enjoyed those kind of books that are not necessarily stories in themselves, but kind of field guides to an existing world. I think one that everybody knows these days is the Spiderwick Chronicles Field Guide. And before that, there was I had when I was a kid, the Wildlife of Star Wars, which was like a field guide to the different, animals and alien creatures that lived on all these planets. I had all of the Star Wars technical manuals that like said, how all the ships worked and how the technology functioned. So that's the kind of like really immersive like world building that I always enjoyed. And so I was always writing, always trying to create my own worlds. But it really wasn't until later, really after college, that I had thought about writing professionally. I had this notion after college. I had my degree in anthropology. I thought I was going to get a job right away working in a museum laboratory. That didn't work out, so I started to think, oh, well, maybe I could get a master's degree in journalism and become a science journalist, because I enjoy science and communicating science to people. But that never really worked out. But I started to practice my nonfiction writing skills at that time. And while I eventually did get several jobs working in museums, the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns kind of threw all that up in the air. Like a lot of people, I was indefinitely laid off. And so I had to land on my feet quickly. And I, luckily, a few months before that, I had started submitting my first articles, mostly to Catholic blogs, because faith has always been an important part of my life. And so basically, ever since the pandemic of 2020, I've been writing professionally in some capacity, and it's been a wild ride.
Wow, yeah, it really sounds like it. And that's neat though that your love for writing started with the idea of world building and those
Mm-hmm.
elaborate. I think you'd mentioned you like the epic fantasies and all those little details that you can get in creating your own worlds. Tell me a little bit about your children's book because it sounds like you write lots of different genres because there's
Oh,
the
yeah.
sci-fi and then you have this new book coming out with Word on Fire this year. So is this your first published book, and how did you choose children's book as your angle that you wanted to go in?
Yeah, so this is my first published title, The Riddle of the Tungstones, or How Blessed Nicolas Steno Uncovered the Hidden History of the Earth. And
Oh,
this book
wow.
has kind of an interesting story behind it because when I was in college, I think I first learned of Nicolas Steno because he was essentially the first geologist. His theories are in the first few pages of any intro to geology textbook. He did a lot of pioneering work on what we would today call stratigraphy, or which is in interpreting the different layers of stone and rock in a geological formation. He did a lot of really innovative work on fossils. He was basically one of the first people to convincingly argue that fossil bones, shells, and teeth are exactly what they appear to be, the remains of living organisms. Before this, many people had thought that these odd-shaped rocks just simply grew in the ground like crystals, and that the fact that they looked like bones and shells and teeth was merely coincidence. But Steno, because he was an anatomist originally, somebody who studied human and animal bodies for a living, was able to make the connection in his mind. And so and what a lot of those textbooks won't tell you though is that Nicolas Steno, he was always a Christian, but he converted to Catholicism while living in Italy and studied for the priesthood and eventually became a bishop, and he's now on the road to sainthood. He was beatified by Pope St. John Paul II, actually in the year I was born in 1988. So there's another little personal connection there. But as someone who's always been interested in the church's sort of dialogue with science and its involvement in the world of science, I mean, my confirmation saint is Albert the Great, who was an encyclopedist and is the patron of natural science. So I've always had, ever since I learned about Nicolas Steno, I've had an interest in him. And I had always thought of writing something about him because there's only one book in English about his life, and it's currently out of print. And I really have to thank my mom for encouraging me to write this as a children's book. That was her idea. And at first I kind of blew her off. I was like, Mom, I don't write for kids. I don't know what you're talking about. But she kept insisting that I could do this. And at one point I was preparing to attend the Catholic Writers Guild online conference in 20, I think it was the 2022 that year. And I knew I wanted something to pitch at the conference. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I just write that children's book? And so I took an entire month or two, and that was pretty much all I was doing, was writing and rewriting the draft for this book. And I did pitch it at the conference in 2022. The publisher who I pitched to invited me to submit it. They ultimately rejected it, but they had some very nice things to say about it. It simply wasn't a good fit for their publishing house, which I totally understood. And then a friend of mine, Matt Becklow, who's part of the publishing team at Word on Fire, said, I was telling him about this project, and he's like, well, why don't you submit it to our children's editor, Haley Stewart, at Word on Fire Votive, and see what she thinks. So I did. I wrote up a book proposal and sent it in, and in on May 1st, 2023, I got the exciting news back that it was accepted, which I totally did not expect, was not banking on. But, you can tell I still remember the date. So it's like it's kind of burned into my brain. But the last sort of year and a half, like however many months it's been since then, has been rewrites and revisions and getting sent the artwork and approving the interior. People don't know how much goes into getting a book published, especially a very heavily illustrated children's book. And the illustrations by Dylan Wheelock are just superb. They're done as like a sketchbook style. And as soon as this was pitched to me by Haley, I said, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I want. And I was reminded of Dinotopia, which has the images and also the little marginalia written in the side. So I'm like, that's exactly what I want. And so the book is made to look like a beat up old geologist's field notebook. And it has the sketchbook style illustrations, and all of the vocab call out boxes for the vocabulary words are all done to make they look like specimen labels. And so this is for like middle school aged readers. I'd say between 8 and 13-ish. And I'm just it's been so edifying to finally have, to be able to say I'm a published writer and to have this coming out. So yeah, February 2025 is when I'm hoping this will finally be up for sale on Word on Fire Votive. And I just got, right before Christmas, all of my advance copies. So I couldn't be happier with it. It's just splendid.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's so exciting. And it's neat that from when you were first loving books, it was, the Spiderwick Chronicles, Dinotopia, and then your first book is in line kind of with what you loved about those early books when you were younger. So that's so neat. I've been really fascinated by, like seeing how science and faith can go together. I remember I finished my master's in theology last year, and I had to take like a class that was about like philosophy and faith and science, and that was the first time that I really got to study like how these two can go together, like the idea of two wings that we rise up with, the wing of faith and science.
Yes.
So we can learn about the world, and they don't have to be separate, but they mutually inform one another. So that's so neat that, again, that's another one that I haven't heard of. I haven't heard of Nicolas before, so.
That was the other thing I wanted to do, is bring more people's attention to this guy, because whenever I would mention him in conversation, nobody would know who he was. And and of course I knew him from my studies in geology and anthropology, and so I'm like, I've got to make this guy more known, and also to really inspire kids, not just to teach them that, of course, like faith and science don't have to be antagonistic like the common narrative is nowadays, but also to teach them that it's okay to have a roving, curious mind. Because that's one of the things in my deep research about Steno's life that I discovered, was that his life wasn't a straight line, like a straight track from one thing to another. And he often worried with the fact that he had so many of these competing interests that he was juggling. He often worried that he'd never learn enough about one thing to make a stable career out of it. And that's something that I can really identify with, because I have so many eclectic interests. And, he was a physician, an anatomist, and then he started working on this geology project, and then he found a vocation to the priesthood. And even after he was ordained a priest, he was still learning. He was still making discoveries in anatomy and geology. And especially, and I saw this in a lot of my peers in the sciences, where higher education and even elementary school and high school now is pushing young people into these very hyper specialized tracks, that they're worried that I can't be interested in anything else. I just have to be focused, hyper focused on this one thing for my entire life, or I'll never make a stable career. And it's just like, no, you can be this sort of omnivore and, and revel in all the knowledge and wonder of creation that God has laid out for us. God can use both types of mind. Not everybody is made to be that kind of hyper-focused, hyper-specialized individual. A lot of us are generalists, and that's okay. And I think in our hyper STEM oriented society now, that can get a little bit lost.
Definitely. Well, yeah, what you were mentioning about the faith kind of leads into my next question about how does your faith inspire your approach to creative works, or how do you see your writing or your museum work as even co-creation efforts with Christ, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people, I'm a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I kind of learned about the whole co-creation idea through reading not just his books like The Lord of the Rings, but reading his thoughts on it in his essays and his letters. And once I learned about that, that really started to inspire me because, again, there's this idea that writing is a lonely business. You sit alone at your computer and just type, and you've got to create this whole thing on your own, and it's easy to fall into that trap. And oh gosh, I've fallen into it so many times where we can become preoccupied with, this is my project, this is my story, this is my essay. And I've noticed that whenever I fall into those patterns of thinking, it doesn't go anywhere. As soon as I stop, as soon as I give it over to God and say, okay, this is your project, I'm just the scribe, I'm willing to go where this takes me, then I notice things become much smoother. That's basically what I did with Riddle of the Tungstones. It was the book I didn't want to write, but I told God, you know what? I'm not going to be good at this children's writing thing. I just know it, but you know what? I'm going to leave it in your hands and do it anyway. And I've just noticed this pattern between those projects and the ones that I really want to do. And, I forget to ask God's input at all. And then I notice those projects stall and don't go anywhere. So I definitely think that we're not meant to create alone, either as people, because I love writers groups. I love groups like Catholic Writers Guild and Legend Fiction, where I've met so many great mentors and colleagues who you can write with and share your work with. But I also think, we're not there theologically, we're not meant to write or create alone. We really need to be creating with God rather than not so much against him, but sort of in our own way, because the work, even if we're writing something that's explicitly religious, there can be a way in which we're doing it against, like, contrary to God's plans, because even that can become an idol in a sense, where especially when we become hyper focused on it being my project, my ideas.
Yeah, no, those are great insights. And we're in the same critique group with Legend Fiction. And that was actually the first time I was actively sharing my work in real time and having it
Right.
read aloud. And yeah, it was a little bit daunting at first, but then I realized, yeah, like having these other voices and these input to create, this story is really helpful and beneficial. And yeah, it really speaks to that idea that we're not just like a one-man island writing our work.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the best product when we have the help of others as well, and we're turning to God as well ultimately for our guidance and inspiration. So that's great. Well, tell me a little bit about physical creation and if that inspires you at all in your writing, because you mentioned a lot about epic fantasies and this idea of world building. So I know for me, I love animals and nature, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I spend time going on hikes outdoors or inspired by the pets that I have. So is there anything in particular in creation that really inspires you that you find kind of crops up in your writing?
Well, yeah, a couple of things. One, I mean, like, the whole purpose behind Riddle of the Tungstones is to get kids interested in the natural world around them. Because it's about, like, Steno spent a lot of time scouring the hills of Tuscany looking for fossils, and that thrill of discovery. When I was a kid, I was always down at the beach. I had a rock, still do. I have my rock collection from when I was a kid. I was always down at the beach picking up interesting rocks and shells. I live on the North Shore of Long Island, which is mostly glacial geology, so there's a lot of interesting little bits left behind, whether it's Indian arrowheads or an occasional fossil here and there, or just interesting rocks and minerals, a lot of quartz, rose quartz and interesting things that you pick up off the ground. So that sort of thrill of discovery. My other favorite books when I was a kid were all about going out into the wilderness and discovering something. There was a treasure island, of course. There was a huge impact on me was Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, or any story that involved going into the jungle or into some faraway place and discovering some lost city or a hidden secret, or I was always drawn to the stories of prospectors and paleontologists from long ago who would go to the far corners of the earth looking for archaeological treasures or digging up the bones of dinosaurs in some remote place. And I've never been able to do it myself. I've never been able to go on one of these expeditions, but that thrill of discovery of the unknown and of going to some remote place outside of the big urbanized area where I live in, that's always been a big inspiration on not all of my writing projects, but a lot of them. And a lot of my fiction, I've loved like looking at field guides and guidebooks, either of existing animals, the strange and exotic bestiaries of various fictional worlds. And I've always had this love of animals too. I was often at the zoo or at the Natural History Museum, and I've always loved how God's creation is this kind of almost infinite variety of creatures. Like it seems to never reach a limit. And then that's what I love about creating imaginary creatures too. It's a way of co-creation. You're sort of part of that imaginative mind. And there are creatures in the real world that are almost stranger than fiction. And it just shows that there's this infinite creative mind that has brought all this into being. And I often find that creating imaginary creatures is a fun way that I can participate in that.
Definitely. Yeah, and there's still like things about creation that we're still discovering. Like I think especially like
Oh,
under
yeah.
the sea,
Mm-hmm.
like they take these submarines down into the deep waters and they're finding these new microscopic creatures, things that live in the dark, deep ocean. And so it's fascinating to think that we still haven't even uncovered everything that's out there in creation, which is really neat. Yeah, like you said, just shows how like diverse and vast the created world is. So great. Well, I'm also curious to hear about your thoughts, because I think we're similar on this, about work and how that applies to creatives, specifically, the traditional sense of like working a 9 to 5 job. And you were talking about how, as creatives, we usually have so many interests and so many things that we fill our time with. And how can we pursue those things, but also still make a living and support ourselves and our families? Like, what's been your journey with that?
Yeah, I've been wrestling a lot with this. And as I said, I basically started writing professionally full time after I got let go from my museum job during the pandemic. But I quickly realized that it wasn't sustainable long term because I am a very meticulous writer. And especially when it comes to nonfiction, I like to have all my ducks in a row. I can't turn out quote unquote content very quickly. So I soon realized that the sort of fast-paced world of real freelance writing is not something that I can do that as being my sole source of income. And I kind of made my peace with that. And that's why I was so happy to recently find my new job at Raynham Hall Museum. And I'm still there part-time, but it's a job that I love because I get to speak to people and talk about all the amazing history here on Long Island. And I love that job too because it also gives me the time to still pursue my creative endeavors. But recently, I've been wrestling a lot with this idea of work and workflow because I've had a lot in the past of mini burnouts. Well, I will work myself into exhaustion. I think it's the scholar side of me that I will just do a deep dive into whatever topic I'm writing about that can last for weeks or sometimes up to a month. And what I'll end up with is enough raw notes to write at least a 10 to 20 page scholarly paper. But then what I'll do with that is condense all of that information into a 2,000 word or so essay. And then that's what goes up and what I get paid for. And I'm like, if I were setting my own rates, I would charge 5 times the amount I make on one of those articles, because it's just the amount of work that goes into them is massive. And no one asks me to work that way. Nobody has asked me, none of my editors, nobody has asked me to contribute those kind of essays with that kind of work behind it. And so this, especially at the beginning of this new year, I'm really trying to ask myself these questions of why do I do that? What is my relationship with work, And I've also found out that by doing that, I was leaving very little time for my passion projects, for my fiction, for my next children's book, the things that I really want to accomplish, because I felt the need to write these incredibly scholarly sounding pieces that really the reward is the wrong word, but it's like it was not worth the investment of time and energy that I've been putting into it. And so that's something that I'm still wrestling with. I think it's because there are two basic sides of my writing identity, the scholar and the storyteller. And I'm starting to ask myself, which of those is more important to me right now? The scholar or the storyteller? And one hasn't won out over the other yet, but this is something I really need to take to the Lord in prayer and say, okay, what is your main calling for me right now? Is it to be the scholar or the storyteller? And hopefully through, prayer and discernment, I can figure that out this year.
Yeah. Yeah. I can kind of relate to that too, in the sense of I've always had I feel like sometimes competing interests, because after college, I've been in a teaching capacity in various different groups. I was teaching at a church at one point. I was doing online teaching for elementary kids, and I taught middle school kids English or theology, and I felt like I did well at it. But my main passion was always the writing and the editing and the storytelling, I realized. So kind of that same thing. I was in the scholarly, like teaching others. And then I said, I really like to just tell stories and help other people write. And so I made that switch. But then also it was okay. I took a financial cut because the teaching jobs were more regular hours, and then the writing and the editing was more on me. Yeah. And I struggled with figuring out, how much do I charge? How much time am I actually putting into this, and how much am I making back? And is this really sustainable? And then most recently, I've just started a part-time job working like an office manager role at a church. And so very similar. I do have a lot of interests, and I'll bounce back and forth. I'm doing this podcast and YouTube and editing and writing and being at conferences. That's a lot to juggle. And how do you make a living and be fairly compensated for what you're doing? And then how do you also still do what you love and enjoy when sometimes you have to take on these other roles for a financial standpoint that isn't maybe as interesting? So
yeah, and I felt that The Riddle of the Tungstones was a good balance of both my scholarly identity and my storytelling identity, because I could take those scientific and historical topics that I was interested in, but also find a way to present them to a young audience by making it an exciting story and a mystery. What are these tungstones? How is Nicolas Steno going to discover what they are? What does that have to do with geology? I was able to make it an interesting and hopefully compelling story for a young audience, while at the same time scratching that itch to talk about science and history and things like that.
Well, congrats again for your book coming out next month. So
Yeah.
what's next for you in terms of books? Do you have another book idea in progress? Are you kind of working on like your essays or other smaller writing at this point, or what's next in the works?
So I do have an idea for a follow-up to Riddle of the Tungstones, and I've told my editor about it, and she's interested, but the marketing team first needs to see how this first one does and how well it sells. But if the Riddle of the Tungstones does well, I would like to write another nonfiction children's book about a different scientific figure, about Henri Breuil. I believe I'm pronouncing his name right. He was a Frenchman from the 20th century. He was a priest as well as an archaeologist. And I first learned about him in my intro to archaeology classes in school. And he is associated with interpreting the famous painted caves at Lascaux in southern France. And those cave paintings have an interesting story because they were actually first discovered in the middle of World War II by some French children and their dog who stumbled upon this strange hole in the ground, and like kids were like, let's explore it. And they went down there with lanterns and found these cave paintings that no one had seen in millennia. And eventually word got back to this priest archaeologist, Henri Breuil, and he was able to help preserve these famous paintings, where now, it's a big tourist attraction in France. And he helped uncover a lot of these lost secrets of the Stone Age and about this early artwork from our ancestors. And so I'm really excited to tell that story next. I've just started the kind of preliminary research. There are some out-of-print books that I need to find either copies of, or Internet Archive might have them, so that I can read more about the details of Breuil's life, and hopefully his story is something I can next bring to my middle grade audience.
Be a neat continuation. Yeah, continuing on that theme of saints and science for children.
Yes.
Books for them. Great. Well, the last question I always like to ask guests is there a particular Bible verse, prayer, song, or person who inspires you as a creative? And you can pick one or all to share on.
Yeah. What my normal prayer routine usually is, I've gotten into the Liturgy of the Hours in the last few years, especially thanks to Word on Fire's handy little monthly booklets. And these are great because they have the morning, evening, and night prayers like in order, and you don't have to go flipping through a giant expensive Liturgy of the Hours book to find all of them in one place. And my mind can be very routine oriented, and I love that sort of ritualistic flow of the Liturgy of the Hours, of going through the different psalms and prayers and scripture readings in a kind of methodical way. And the Liturgy of the Hours really helped me fall in love with the Psalms, and praying with the Psalms has become, something that I look forward to in my own prayer experience, because especially the Psalms contain a lot of raw emotion. And there's a lot there that I think people can really connect with on a deep personal level with the Psalms. And there's a psalm for almost any occasion, whether you're feeling depressed or you're feeling elated or you're feeling angry or frustrated or just lost. There's a psalm for you. I guarantee it. So yeah, the Liturgy of the Hours, both in the Word on Fire booklet and also the kind of abridged version that Magnificat magazine puts out, and especially with all their supplementary readings that they have helped me to establish a dedicated daily prayer routine, which I think is it's so important for our creative lives and just everything in our lives, that we step back for a while at a specific time of day and just, be in the presence of God in prayer. I just think is so important for us every day. Yeah.
True. I've prayed the Liturgy of the Hours as well myself. Usually I like to do night prayer. But yeah, I recently was learning about Liturgy of the Hours and in the past few years, and I do agree it's good to have that routine, and also know with Liturgy of the Hours you're praying along with the whole church.
Yes.
The religious and the clergy, I think a lot of times they have to pray like every day through the Liturgy of the Hours. It's like the prayer of the church. So
yes,
it's cool to know that you're praying at these certain times with so many other people worldwide is pretty neat. Great. Well, those of you who are listening, if you'd like to stay connected with Thomas and his works, check out the show notes that has his email, LinkedIn, Substack, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you again, Thomas, for joining me today. It was great to hear about your creative works and your journey as a Christian creative. We always close each episode with a closing prayer that's oriented towards creative persons. So I'll begin that for us. Creator of the universe, how infinite and astonishing are your worlds, O divine imagination. You created a creator when you imagined me into existence. Breathe breath into so much dust. Let me lament for forgetting daily to rise up out of the clay. Free me from the deceit of the mundane and from the lure of comfort, which dulls all my given edges. Most of all, light of my life, forgive my blindness, open all my eyes, salt me with newness and dreams, fire my soul with your inventive flame. Let me be committed to the world by it and find in it the deepest joy. Universal creativity flow through me, faith to see things not yet seen, hope to overflow broken cisterns, and love to free me forever. Flow, O river, from the holy temple, through my mind to my hand, infuse my work with spirit to feed hungry souls. We pray all these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.